Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Tracy, and for this week's video I'm just going to be showing you guys how to install a busk and create this underbust corset. It has a center front busk and an underwire, as well as a lace up back, ribbon and grommets. I created a digital sewing pattern, so it's available in my Etsy shop. The way I make most of my patterns, I drape first on my dress form, and then I transfer that drape onto paper, and then I perfect it. I can definitely show you guys my process from the drape to the pattern. Just let me know. You'll just cut out your pattern according to your cup size, and you'll just cut on a small, medium, or large for the band size. I realized I've been doing a lot of tutorials on just like tops and corsets, so I'm actually making a dress next week, so it's something different. I hope you guys enjoy this tutorial, and please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Materials needed for this project are the underbust sewing pattern, some lace fabric, bridal net, and any lining. So you can use cotton, wool, or just any woven works great. And I'm using a busk for the center closure. I'm going to show you guys how to put this in, and they come in a variety of different shades of metal. Mine is 10 inches long. Some decorative ruffled trim for the hem, as well as some decorative ribbon or twill tape for your bone channels. You can also just make your own bias tape with your lining fabric of your choosing. I'm using some foldover elastic for the armhole finish, but you can also use bias. And you're going to need underwire channel and your underwire as well. When I first put in my first busk, it was kind of intimidating, but honestly it's so simple. So with the busk, one side has loops and the other side has hooks, and you just hook it together and you can see it closes like so. Once all of your pattern pieces are cut out, you can see that on pattern piece number 1 I've indicated the hooks and where the loops stop and start. Before inserting the busk, we have to sew the lace onto a piece of lining. So you have 4 pieces of lining and 2 lace. I take 1 piece of lace and just place it right on top of 1 piece of lining, and I pin that in place. And I do the same to the other side, and I'm just going to do a basting stitch on either side of this. And I baste with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and just making sure this lace lays flat so I can sew this layer to the lining and not have the lace be all flimsy. And now that that's sewn together, you're just going to take your other lining pieces and your sewing pattern and start marking those loop notches. So as you can see, they're marked on the pattern. So I'm just taking like a pin and just kind of like ripping through the paper so I can use my chalk and just transfer those markings onto the fabric. And I just line up the pattern to the fabric, and I'm just using my chalk and just like rubbing really hard so I can get something to transfer onto the fabric. And when I lift it, you can see that the marks are indicated, and I just go over to just darken them. I repeat this, but I'm marking the hooks, and I just stab those holes and just mark it on the fabric. I realized I was doing this on the wrong piece, so for the hook part it should be marked on the main fabric, so it should be marked on the back of that lace instead of the lining piece, and I'll show you why. I take 1 piece of lace and 1 piece of lining and place right sides together. I don't know where that footage went, but here I am just pinning both layers together, and I'm pinning the side with the loop markings. I'm just taking my ruler and just chalking in the seam allowance so you can see where I'm going to sew, and I marked a 1/4 inch at the top of the gore and a 1/2 inch at the side with the notches for the loop. So I'm just going to be sewing like in an L shape, but when we get to a notch you're going to back tack and skip over that little 1/2 inch area and then sew and back tack, if that makes sense. So I'm starting at the top of the gore and just sewing that normally until I get to that intersection of a 1/2 inch. And once I get there, I'm lifting up my presser foot and pivoting my fabric, and I'm still sewing straight down until I reach that notch, and I'm stopping and I'm back tacking and securing that in place. And I lift my presser foot to just skip over that 1/2 inch until I get to the other side of that notch. So I lay it back down, and then I just start sewing, and then I back tack again to secure it, and I sew all the way down until I reach the next notch. And you're just repeating this, leaving that gap open for the loops. Sometimes when you do this like stop and start method on your sewing machine, it doesn't like it and it starts to like get jammed, so you should just pull out your fabric and like cut the threads and then just restart sewing. After sewing, I just take my scissors and just cut those threads on the areas we skipped over. And since we sewed a corner at the very top of panel 1, you're going to just take your scissor and like cut diagonally, like as close as you can to it, but just don't cut through the thread. So I cut like about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 away, and then you just want to like turn it right side out. And to kind of get like a perfect corner, I just take like something that has a dull point, so anything like round is just easier to like shove it in and get your perfect point. I don't recommend using scissors because you're definitely going to cut through that. And just grab your busk, but grab the loop side, and you can just start placing your busk in between the seam allowance. So when you open the seam allowance, you'll see that there's like the space that we left opened where you can just like put the busk in, so the loops just start peeking out. And I know it's kind of hard to see on black, but I hope you can see me opening the seam allowance and just placing in the loops. As I work my way down, I like to just pin the fabric in place as close to the busk as possible so everything's like taut and secure. And this part is just so satisfying to see the loops completely exposed, and it's going to be hooked on to the hooks like this. So now it's time to just sew the other piece, and we're pretty much repeating the same exact steps, but like I mentioned, I messed up and marked the wrong piece for the hooks, so I'm just taking the pattern piece and just placing it on the wrong side of the lace panel. I take my chalk and just mark the holes for those hooks. I take the lace panel with the markings and place it right on top of the lining piece, and I pin those 2 layers together. And we're going to do the same exact L-shape sewing, and you're just going to sew in the L and then all the way down a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I just take it to the sewing machine and I start sewing at the very top, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and when I get to that intersection, I lift the pressure foot and just sew all the way down a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And there's no need to stop and start because this is for the hooks and we already did the loops. After sewing, you can just clip that corner again, so like a 1/4 of an inch away from that sewing line. And see where we marked those holes? So on the lace, you're going to just take your seam ripper, and I know this part's kind of scary, but you kind of just want to poke through it with it, and then you want to just like use a pencil and just kind of stretch the fibers, and you're going to get like a big hole. It's not really a hole because you didn't cut that, you're just stretching the fibers of the fabric so it can create like a fake hole, if that makes sense. So nothing's gonna fray, and then you can see like you can like pop that little hook through. It's kind of hard to see, but there you go. You can see you can just like pop the hole over those hooks, and you're just gonna like just wiggle your seam ripper, and then just take your pencil and just wiggle it through until you get like a big enough stretch so you can like pop it over your hooks. Repeat this until you finish the last hole, and then it's gonna be time to turn it right side out. So I'm just taking my pencil or a dull object and just kind of making a point on that corner. Just make sure you don't rip anything. And then you can just take your busk and you're going to just place it in a way where the lace can just like pop over those hooks. So push the seam allowance to the back, and this part you're just like pushing those holes like right over those hooks so it just pops through like that. And just repeat this all the way to the bottom and just pin it in place so nothing moves and everything's very taut. And after pinning both busks into place, you can just take it to the sewing machine and you're going to just change your foot to the zipper foot and just line up your foot as close to the busk as possible so you can stitch right next to it. And just make sure you're not stitching on it because your needle will break because you're going to be sewing through steel. So just stitch right next to it as best as you can. And you want to just take this very slow because you don't want to break your needle. And you're just going to repeat the same exact steps for sewing the busk in place with the other side. Now that the busk is sewn in, we can just work on finishing the shell of the underbust corset. So you're going to take pattern piece number 2 and you have a net and a lace. So you're just going to place the right side of the lace facing the right side of the busk and then just pin that in place. And you're going to just take the net and place it on the other side. So you're sandwiching the busk in between those 2 layers. And I'm doing this because I don't want a exposed channel on the outside right next to the busk, but you could always just sew your seams to the outside and do the channel right on top, but I kind of wanted this to just be encased instead. After pinning that in place, I just take it to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And since it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance and it's right next to the busk again, I'm just leaving that zipper foot so I can sew as close as possible to the busk since my seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. And after sewing that seam allowance, since it is sandwiched in between the busk, I want that edge to be clean, so I went ahead and used my overlock machine to overlock that edge so it doesn't fray, and you can just use your regular sewing machine and do a zigzag stitch. So it's going to look like that when the lace is on top, so you can kind of see that serged edge and it looks nicer than just having the raw edge. For serging that edge, I just took it to my sewing machine and did a top stitch, which was about like a 1/4 inch away from the busk, so that's why I left the zipper foot on there because it gave me like exactly a 1/4 inch. Once that seam allowance is top stitched down, on the other side of panel 2 you want to just baste that edge as well as panel 3. So you want to baste the net and the lace together like that, and you're just gonna face wrong sides together and sew your seams to the outside. You just repeat this process, and if you need a more in-depth tutorial, I went over this in the sheer lace corset tutorial. And here I am just sewing all of my seams to the outside, and I'm sewing a 1/2 inch because that is the seam allowance indicated on the pattern. And don't forget to clip your notches so you can match everything up. And that is the shell completely sewn together, and if you need an in-depth tutorial on how to sew the back panel, I go over it in the sheer lace corset, so just reference that for the back panel. It's exactly the same, nothing's different. And now I'm just trimming my seam allowance a 1/4 inch. And the reason we trim our seam allowance is so we can just place our bias tape or just ribbon for our channels right on top of that seam, and it covers it so it gives you a clean finish on the inside of the corset as well as the outside. I used a 1/2 inch velvet ribbon for my bone channels, and I just placed the ribbon right on top of that seam and just like push the seam underneath so the ribbon completely covers the seam, and I stitch one side down following that seam. I go over just very in depth on the sheer corset, like I've mentioned, just reference that for most of the sewing because right here you're just watching me sew. As you can see, I'm just placing that ribbon right on top of the seam and just holding all the fabric taut as I sew on each side. All of the channels are sewn, and don't forget to sew the one right after the grommets because it's bone, grommet, bone. I went ahead and overlocked the hem, and then I just stitched a ruffle right on top of it. This was like a ruffle with an elastic. I just used a regular straight stitch since I was sewing it onto a rigid fabric. I sewed some velvet ribbon right on top of the top part of the ruffle just because I didn't like the elastic part showing, so I just stitched on both sides of the ribbon. And I'm just making sure to follow the hemline, and when you get to the busk, you kind of want to just like sew away from it so you don't stitch on top of it and break your needle. And after sewing the hem, I just take my bones and start cutting and tipping them. If you need an in-depth tutorial, you can watch my Regency Bustier tutorial, and I go over how to cut bones and tip them. I end up with 12 bones, and I just place them in between the lace and the ribbon, so just right inside the bone channel. After placing all of the bones in, I just remove the excess at the armhole and I trim away the excess at the underwire. And since this is an underbust corset and there's just going to be an underwire, I'm just melting that bone channel at the underwire. And now for the most satisfying part, which is the underwire channel. I'm cutting out 2 pieces that are 9 inches long, and just keep in mind this measurement is different depending on your cup size, so just follow what I have written down for your designated cup. So you want to just place that underwire channel 1/4 inch below the seam allowance, so it's going to be exactly lined up with the underbust. I take it to the sewing machine and I like to place it right on top and like stretch as I sew. So I just place the channel right on top of the frame, and I start on the left side and just sew that down so I can make sure I'm lined up to the edge of the underbust. So I'm stitching right on the very edge, so I'm catching the underwire channel and the lace fabric. As you can see, I'm sewing very slowly, so I'm like kind of stretching the underwire channel as I sew so I can follow the exact curve. And just sew slowly, because when you get to like the deeper curve, you want to just like sew, stop, and like slightly pivot so you can get the exact curve. And when you're stitching the other side of the wire channel, you want to just turn your garment over and stitch on the wrong side so you can see the seam allowance and stitch at the very edge, catching the seam allowance as well as the wire channel. After sewing the wire channel in place, you can grab your underwire, and remember the short side of the underwire is the center front, so I just start at the center front and just start by putting in the underarm side first. So I just feed it all the way through and just keep pushing it all the way down until it's completely inside. I love putting underwires in, it just gives it so much more structure and I just love the look. So now we can clean finish the center front gore. At the center front of the gore where the wire channel is, you want to just do a zigzag stitch to tack that wire channel closed. And finally, to just clean finish the armhole, I'm using just some foldover velvet elastic, and the width was like 1/4 inch foldover, so I'm just placing the very edge and lining it up to the fold of the foldover elastic and just sewing a straight stitch because I don't need this to stretch, so I'm not even stretching the elastic and just doing a straight stitch. You can also just clean finish it with bias, it's your choice. I trim the excess of the elastic as straight as possible so it lines up with the underwire, and then I just take a lighter and just burn the ends. Almost burned a lot more than that. So I just burn the ends so it melts and then it's just completely sealed and it won't fray.